We are sensory beings. I guess that's why I love the work that Carl Jung has done so much of, and some of the great scholars and leaders of our movement. And what I mean by that is that we are influenced by what's around us. That's the nature of this human journey that we're on. That's why when we can walk into a place like this, which the center here, which I think is absolutely gorgeous, and the people who are involved in making it gorgeous, I thank them every time I walk in here. It has an impact on us. There's a whole psychology of color. Years ago, when I worked in juvenile corrections, there was this idea of trying to find colors within institutions where, unfortunately, some young people found themselves to try and bring about soothing and calm and even joy and a shifted perspective. And on a day like today, when we are out in nature today, or really any incarnation of nature, sometimes we find it just having this incredible power to shift us. And so Carl Jung and other people have looked at have used the sensory idea as a concept for healing in what Carl Jung calls archetypes or boilerplates in terms of patterns that we can look for in our lives. And he worked with people for many years through dreams and through synchronicities. Synchronicities meaning certain things show up for us in certain times. You know, what does it mean when the blue jay comes and flitters in front of my window? Or what's it mean when I'm at the coast and I feel like that there is this gorgeous scape of fog and storm and moonlight that is just for me, and it shifts my awareness? Or we might hear a piece of music that brings us to tears, and that touches something deeply inside of us. And so there are these ideas that while in spirituality and religion, if we think today on a Sunday, this whole Chico, all the churches that are in this town, all the places of worship, all the places where people come to have religious conversations, spiritual conversations. And so if we think about it, there's all these buildings and ideas and belief systems that are based on principles that are basically invisible. Have you ever can you see intention? Can you see love? Can you see forgiveness? Can you see compassion? Can you see ascension? No, you can't see those things. You see the results of those things. But on the front end of it, spirituality is always asking us to enter into the idea of that. That's where faith comes in. I speak my intention. So I use my words, I formulate it. I can't see it. I don't know what it looks like. I can't draw it up on a whiteboard. I don't have a mathematical formula, at least yet, right? Maybe physics will come up with that. But we do see the outcomes. We do see what happens. And so take what I just did, a prayer. Who was it to? What was it to? Where does it land? Where does it go? Where does it come from? These are all ideas that we work with in spirituality, the invisible. In our teaching talks about the reality behind the physical, the truth behind the physical, the intention behind the physical. That there is a marriage between the ethereal, the invisible, and what we can see and what we can experience. And so people like Carl Jung and other people through metaphysics have said, okay, we can take our concrete, world, we can take our colors, we can take our buildings, we can take our icons, we can take our birds and our bees, and we can do something with them in terms of shifting how we feel. When I was about somewhere between 18 and 19, I stepped on a ship and I headed to the Mediterranean by way of the United States Navy. And the ship I set sail on, although it wasn't sail, but we like to say that. That sounds good. Like Popeye would say, we set sail. And so I was on an aircraft carrier, and so went on that ship. And when I walked on that thing, it just blew my mind. I'd never seen so many people on a steel structure in my whole life that was sitting on the ocean. And, It just blew my mind. And I was a long way from home. It was Jacksonville, Florida. I was a California boy. Ended up back there, and the within 24 hours of me stepping on that ship, we were heading off the dock to the Mediterranean, going into the Atlantic Ocean. And it was a mind blower for me. I didn't know how to really handle that. And so when you're at sea on an aircraft carrier, at least the one I was on, 5,000 people on that boat, and all those planes and all that stuff going on, and it just seemed like you were just overwhelmed with humanity and technology. I mean, it's like imagine living inside a car motor or something. That's what it's like being in a ship. You're inside this machine that is going down, out there in the ocean. And so you wake up in the morning. I woke up my first morning. I came out the deck and looked out there, and there was no land, there was no cars, there was no people, there was just ocean. But then all these people with me, and my circuits were pretty blown. And at that time in my life, I had a child on the way, and my life was chaotic, and my life was overwhelming, and I was nothing but walking confusion and anxiety, and didn't know which direction to go, and I was just full. My humanity was just overwhelmed with this thing called life and where it was going. My teenage years had been, interesting. My 20s were going to be interesting. I didn't know that yet, but anyway, and I was making a lot of interesting choices. And so I'm in this world, and about 3 months into it, with everything in the interior of me going on inside, everything around me, I felt a profound emptiness. I felt a profound sense of loss and being lost. I wouldn't admit that. I had been raised in a very religious background. I had pushed that aside, and yet there was a void in me that I didn't identify for years until years later. So psychologically, spiritually, kind of a interesting cauldron of stuff. So this one day, we pulled into a port for a few days. It was either Italy or Spain, and I can't remember which. And we were probably in port for about a week before we would head back out. And so this one day, usually I went out with my shipmates, as Popeye would say, and we would sometimes spend evenings using beverages that would alter how we felt spiritually and emotionally, and sometimes we would deposit what we ate earlier in the evening overboard because the sea in port could be kind of rough too, and so you've got two varieties of sickness coming together as one, and it was pretty interesting. But this one day I decided to go off on my own onto what we called the beach. We called it the beach. And so I'm wandering around, and there was this amazing Catholic church. And so it's either Spain or Italy. So this is real Catholicism. This ain't American Catholicism. And it was gorgeous and ancient and old, and just it just looked so gothic, and it was just like just a little kid from rural California just looking up at that. So I walked in, and I went in, and the stained glass and the statuary and the candles, and you want to talk about sensory, and I was just like, wow, just felt transformed. And I was a little bit afraid because being raised a Protestant, the Catholics were considered the other team. Kind of like if you're a Giant, it's like the Dodgers, and so the Catholics were the Dodgers, and I don't know if I should be there, And so anyway, and I will never forget this. I kind of walked in, and I just right away, there's kind of a reverence, and if your shoes were kind of, you just didn't want your shoes to be quiet. And about halfway up in these gorgeous old wooden, whatever, pews, there was a woman who was right out of National Geographic, man, I'm telling you. She was dressed, darkly, very ethnic, had the little kneeling thing was down that they have in Catholic churches, and she was knelt down, and she was gazing up at this altar that was just immense and statuary and all these lights and incense and all this stuff. And she had her hands up, and I could see the prayer beads coming down, and she was just staring into this place. And the look on her face was just absolutely, she was enraptured with calm. And I looked at her, and I never saw her from the front. I only stood back, you know, and I looked at her and I was just like, oh my God. She's found a place to be. And whatever was going on in her life out there, I don't know her, but she was drawn to this place to just sit and be. A place where, as Buddhism talks about the idea of taking refuge in the Dharma, which means to take refuge in the teaching, the principles, the truths. And of course, refuge is a word, as Dr. Carol McEwen taught me to do. Always look up your words in dictionaries. I looked up refuge this week to make sure, and it's a place where I feel safe, protected, where I feel like the idea of there's a high watch of some kind. I come to that place. And as a 19-year-old kid with all going on with me and stuff, I looked at her and I wanted that. I yearned for that. I could, and it, that, and the thing about that was that it took me a lot of years to sort out a lot of stuff. I didn't find this teaching until I was in my 30s. And it was when I found this teaching, a spirituality that fit for me, is where I could relate to that. I was working with a young woman one time, professionally, and she was someone who came from a really harsh background. And you can just imagine, and she was someone with substance use issues. And her substance use issues had become a form of refuge for her. Not a healthy refuge, an unhealthy refuge, but nevertheless a refuge. If any of you ever if you have loved ones or whatever, and you wonder about what addiction is, you have to contemplate that part of it. Part of it is a refuge. You may not see it that way, but that's where it is, right? So she wanted to overcome that refuge. That's why, she was at a place where I was working with her. And so I said to her one time, I was trying to talk to her about the power of visualization, affirmation and visualization. Now, before I go any further, I want to read something that's in Buddhist teaching around taking refuge in the Dharma. And this is what it says. This is achieved through deeply held beliefs and practices where faith is expressed through that act of taking refuge. That's interesting. In other words, what caused the woman in Italy or Spain, wherever she was, to walk into the church? And so what Buddhism is teaching is that is part of the gifts we get from the refuge. It's faith. I read this recently, and I've always wondered why in religion that sometimes belief and faith become the same thing, because in my mind they're not. And I sometimes I can be an English wonk. I nerd out on, we need to use the proper way. Faith and religion aren't exact. Faith and belief, they're not the same thing. But until I read this, now I get it, right? And so what I was trying to do was I was working with someone to come up with some visualization, some affirmation. And my question was simply this, because she had no idea what peace really meant. She had no idea where she had never experienced in her life, in her recollection, where she could just be at peace. That's what today's about. Be at peace. And so I'm trying to get her to come up with an archetype, a visualization of where she could do that. And so I said, what do you got? So we talked and talked and talked. I said, okay, now let's reverse engineer this. Tell me where some of the biggest trauma in your life happened to where you could not have peace. You could not be. And she talked about she always dreaded going to bed her whole life growing up because generally when she went to bed, the house would be in an uproar because certain people in the house would have a running start with whatever they were doing, and by the end of the evening, there would be a lot of trauma, drama, stuff like that. And so it's like, and seriously, I mean, it's like, am I going to wake up and is there going to be someone gone, or is the house going to be left, or am I going to, be okay, whatever, right? I said, okay, let's reverse engineer that. What would you have liked that to be? And it was interesting because somehow this really triggered something in her. You want to talk about divinity. And she said, and this is what she said: I'm tucked into bed by someone I know loves me, who I can trust. And I can fall asleep in peace, knowing I'm all right. And so she latched onto that, and so we began to start working with that. And what's interesting about now this is where the faith comes in, is because and you for those of you in your own life, or if you're working with other people, if you can get people to grab a hold of visualizations, affirmative work, what's really wonderful is if you can talk them through that a few times and then ask them to talk themselves through it verbally, openly, and you're there with them, that's where the faith begins. It's all an inside job. Even if there is an icon or a place or a color or a ritual you do that is your touchstone to be, it is ultimately an inside job. That's what Buddhism is saying. This also brought something up to me in terms of our tradition, but many traditions, is that if we look back at people like the Buddha, the person Siddhartha, the Buddha, and Jesus, they were itinerant teachers. They didn't have buildings. They didn't have temples. They didn't have churches. They were itinerant. And so they walked around and they would go into a community for a while and they would talk, except for the people that walked around with them, which they all had, disciples. There's a great tradition of that. But they would come from places to place. So sometimes people would maybe see the Buddha or Jesus and they wouldn't see him again for 6 months or something. And so it's like, well, where's my teacher? Where's my temple? Where's my, because both Jesus and Buddha worked outside. They were religious revolutionaries. They weren't in the temples. They weren't in the they were on the hillside. And so the Buddha and Jesus had to leave them with the idea it's an inside job. How can I find peace if you're not here? It's an inside job. How can I find peace if the Romans are acting up again? It's an inside job. Sound familiar to now? Can I find it if there's some acting up going on? Yes. So some of you know I'm a Jonathan Livingston Seagull freak, and I love this interesting, crazy little book that came out, which was never supposed to succeed and did. And then there was a movie, and it was interesting and crazy, right? And so Neil Diamond, who ended up writing the soundtrack for this, I'm going to leave you with this. And if you listen closely, you're going to hear that place to be. You're going to hear taking refuge in the Dharma, but you're going to hear faith. So Neil Diamond wrote, B, a page that aches for a word that speaks on a theme that is timeless. And the one God will make for you this day. B, a whispered voice overheard by the soul, undertook by the heart, and the one God will make for you this day. And so it is. Thank you.